Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's catechesis. So before we begin, let's say a prayer and then we can jump into the lesson. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Illumine our hearts, O Master, who loves mankind, with the pure light of your divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand your gospel teachings. Implant also in us the fear of your most blessed commandments, so that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well pleasing unto thee. For you are the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and unto thee to ascribe all glory, together with your fathers from everlasting, and your all holy, good, and life-creating Spirit, now and ever and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Okay, I think everyone's on now. Gerasimos, welcome everyone to the catechesis. So, for anyone who's new, we run catechesis on Thursday nights, specifically so we can learn more about the Orthodox faith. And we've covered many different topics over the last few years, but this year we have decided to take a journey through the lives of the saints, and we choose a saint or a group of saints from each century. And now we're already on the 9th century, so the year 800 and something. And we're going to be speaking about two very special saints in the Orthodox Church, Saints Cyril and Methodius. They were famous. They were given the titles equal to the apostles because they played a huge role in missionary work, especially to the Slavic people. But the general theme of tonight's lesson is not just about their life, but about language, about written language especially, and its role in the spiritual life and the religious life. Of course, as Christians, we have holy writings that go back to the time of the Jews, the Hebrew scriptures, later on the Greek scriptures in the New Testament, and how those became our texts that we read and the base text for all Christians, and how the translation of these texts had made a huge impact on various cultures and peoples, and including what Cyril and Methodius did. So I've got some slides I'm going to share it with you guys. Also, please feel free to ask questions along the way or make comments. It's an open discussion, so don't have to wait till the end to ask questions or anything like that. Okay, I'm going to share a window, and hopefully you guys can let me know if it's going to be full screen or not. And anyone let me know, is it a full screen? Can just 1 second to let someone in. Oh, you can't see this thing. Okay, so I'm going to share in a different way. I'm going to share the whole screen, and then it should be fine. That seems to have worked the best. Okay, unfortunately, it does that mirror thing. Okay, hopefully everyone can see now. Could someone maybe just let me know?
Yes, thank you.
Is that better, yeah?
Yeah, much better.
Okay, thank you, Rolf. Okay, so before we talk about Saint Cyril and Methodius, let's discuss a little bit about sacred scripture and language in the Orthodox Church. So the picture I put here is actually not a Christian story. It's an ancient story, the oldest written, possibly religious text, which is can anyone guess?
Epic of Gilgamesh?
That's the one. So that's a scene from it. But basically that particular writing was Sumerian writing, dates back about 2000 BC. And it was kind of a story that was a sacred story for the Sumerians. And it was carried down and written down in cuneiform. So it's probably one of the oldest religious texts, okay? Not our text, but still interesting that in the same region that our sacred scriptures come from, there was this understanding of sacred stories already from so many thousands of years ago. So let's look a little bit at this and about language. So, it's quite fascinating when we think about when you sit and read a book, for example. You are opening some pieces of paper with symbols on them. Let's just say you took someone that had never seen writing before in their life, and you put a book in front of them and they opened it. They would literally just see little black symbols in lines across a page. And those little symbols, they would maybe look at it and find little patterns in the symbols, whatever, but they wouldn't be able to generate the symbols and the meaning of the symbols like someone who knows how to read in that particular language, who knows what those symbols mean. And the amazing thing about that is that human beings have this ability to process this symbolic information, right? That is not a literal representation of that thing, right? So, and that's what written language does. And that also, the interesting thing about that is, of course, when we read a book, we read a text, we have to generate those ideas from those symbols ourselves. And so we become a filter for that as well. So when we read a story, let's just say a story about a mother and child. If to one person that would conjure up a beautiful image, maybe some others who had a traumatic childhood would be a different type of image, but they would generate images from the same words, different images. So there's real power in symbolic language. And we know that human beings began very early on to make marks. Let's just start from the right in the beginning, right? And these marks took on meanings, right? Maybe they would trace the outlines of the animals that they hunted and the animals that they found inspiring, sacred, whatever you want to say. And there's even some evidence when you look at some ancient cave paintings like the ones in France, etc. There were some kind of like rhythmic dots that were placed on them, and they were seen as maybe possibly like a calendar type of thing where they were counting the moons, the full moons. And these more literal symbols then were condensed or simplified into less literal symbols, so that were highly symbolic and had to be understood in that way. And that's basically where writing comes around. Now, the reason why that's important is because to convey a message, the more literal we have to represent it, the more difficult it is, right? So let's just say it's like what a graphic novel takes 100 pages to actually illustrate can be condensed into one page of writing, of symbolic writing, like as writing that we know today, because those symbols are attached to the story, the meaning that we can interpret. So writing becomes this amazing new way in which people start to communicate, and most likely early on people wanted to pass on and communicate their sacred stories in writing so that it may be passed on. And this happened parallel, I would say, with oral stories, and there came certain moments in different cultures' history where they want to write it down. Now, certain civilizations came quicker to writing on creating a writing system, right? So, and the oldest system we know of comes from Sumer, which is like modern day Iran, I would say, Iraq. Anyway, Mesopotamia, that type of place, where people would write on clay tablets. And even in the Sumerian poem from 1800 BC, it actually speaks about this. It says this: because the messenger's mouth was heavy and he couldn't repeat the message, the Lord of Kulaba patted some clay and put words on it like a tablet. And until then, there had been no putting words on clay. So they understood this is a new way in which to convey a message. And this particular, these two little tablets here, or this tablet, I think, is the oldest found tablet with a writing system that people have found. Also, I think from around that time. And so basically what people would do is, it's a really cheap method of writing things down. They would take wet clay, they would pat it down and make it into a little square or whatever, sometimes different shapes. And then they would take a wooden stick and create symbols, which was a language that they had developed. Now, you can see these early symbols had kind of parallels, like hieroglyphics, right? Little hands, and that looks like a foot. And these placed together could create either a counting system, and also some kind of early language, written language. And you can see, for example, here you can see how letters were simplified from pictures. So, for example, here's a little picture of an antelope, and then it's simplified into basically like a symbol of a letter. And we often see that a lot of the early alphabets, at least some of the letters, you can trace to actual pictures, and we'll look at that now as well. So just like you see with the Egyptians, they had a more of a picture, hieroglyphic type of language, where you can actually recognize the pictures, like a little owl, like a whatever. But these had corresponding sounds. And so, as is written here, basically, a writing system had to satisfy 3 criteria in general. First of all, the writing is not just squiggles or scrapes or something. It has to convey meaning, right? It needs to convey information, right? It must be communicated through the text. Secondly, the writing must be put on some kind of medium, like clay, paper, parchments, papyrus. So you need a medium in which to write, right? So it has to be put on something, on a rock. And then also the symbols used in the writing system usually have to correspond to elements of spoken language. So the written language and the spoken language are moving together, right? And the spoken language comes first. And then that gets codified into these symbols. Okay. So this is all very, very interesting. When you look at, for example, even the idea when you speak about the story of creation, how the word of God spoke the word, and then creation comes into being, and then it's often spoken as the handwriting of God, creation. So there's even this kind of this parallel, this image of creation as the handwriting of God, right? The movement from an idea, a spoken word, into something that is actually written. Right? And we even get to like the 10 Commandments that were engraved by God Himself on Mount Sinai, right? So God wrote Himself, divinely inscribed the tablets. Okay, so the amazing thing is that our faith, sorry, let me just let this person in. Our faith is, there we go. I think everyone's in. Is based within, or at least has its origins within these ancient cultures that began writing, right? Sumeria, but also the ancient Phoenicians, Canaanites, etc. And Hebrew was one of these ancient languages that was a written symbolic language, so that had transitioned away from pictures into an actual type of set letters that were used to convey messages. And proto Hebrew, you could call it, Paleo Hebrew, was pretty similar to ancient Phoenician, Canaanite languages, Moabite languages. So it wasn't necessarily unique, but it was very old, one of the oldest writing systems. And here's an illustration of how, for example, letters developed. You see the ancient letter Aleph, A started as a picture of an ox. And then it slowly developed into these various forms of Hebrew. This is early Phoenician Hebrew. This is the Pool of Siloam inscription that they found, that type of Hebrew, early Aramaic, the Hebrew in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You see how it kind of develops and moves to a different symbol. And even sometimes the Greek and the Latin adopted some of these. So, but what was amazing is that the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, began to write down from the time of Moses, most likely, began to write down the revelations and the stories that had been revealed to them by God. And by doing so, Hebrew became a sacred language because it was the language that conveyed these immensely important stories. So there are some ideas, understandings. In fact, a lot of the early church fathers and a lot of the Jewish people still today believe that Hebrew represents one of the early languages, like the language of God, basically. And that it's a sacred language in and of itself. Others would say, and I would probably be on this side, is that the Hebrew language was used by God, but it became holy because it began to become an ark. It became a carrier of these sacred stories. And so God made it holy, a language that was developed by people with God's help, obviously, and inspiring them. But it became a holy, sacred language because it carried the sacred stories. And once that happens, you see, once people stop writing things like, most writing that they find from Sumeria and all these places was like shopping lists and stock counting and things like that. But now when a text is codified into a sacred text that now, because it's holy, it cannot be changed, and it has authority, it starts to become its authority and its influence becomes much more powerful. And so we get the idea of sacred scripture, the scriptures that cannot be changed and altered, and ultimately begin to develop and influence human ideas, because now these stories are recorded and kept and read by each generation. And so it becomes an important, let's just say, cornerstone of the civilization, of a people, of a worldview. And so the scriptures play an amazing role in this, and especially Hebrew. And the interesting thing is that, of course, Hebrew, the written Hebrew that was used in the sacred texts, didn't remain as it was. It developed, and Aramaic was like the language spoken in the general region, by the Persians, etc. And it was a much larger language. It was very close to Hebrew, but not the same. And that was like the common language. But Hebrew, because it was codified into the sacred text, it remains used even by the Jews. For example, when the Jews were taken, the educated aristocratic Jews, when they were taken into exile to Babylon, they took their sacred language with them and their sacred texts with them, and Hebrew remained even in Babylon. Although they spoke the language of the people there, their sacred language was kept as Hebrew. Okay. Another thing that texts carry, just like stories carry, are motifs. And I just wanted to show you this in a quick demonstration. But and the amazing thing is that when you have these written words, you can create these beautiful patterns that get kind of codified into texts. So, for example, I'm taking now the Greek, just because it's a bit easy to understand for me to read, which is a translation from the Hebrew, the beginning of Genesis, and part of the beginning of John's Gospel. And so we see the words, for example, so these are patterns that, so it's not only now just a story, but even a pattern of words, how these words are used in different stories. So, for example, the beginning, the first words of the Hebrew scriptures, right, is in the Greek translation, "En arche episin o theos ton uranon ke ti." In the beginning, Archi, think of like archives or archaeology, right? Ancient, like in the beginning, made God the heavens and the earth, right? And then we see John many 1,200 years later, even more, he writes about another Genesis, the Genesis of man through Jesus Christ. En archi, exactly same beginning. Pros tonteon, in the beginning, he was in the beginning with God. He's talking about the Logos, the Word. And then it goes on to say, in him was life, and afto zoe, and life was the light of the world. So we see the word phos, light, and then when we go on to when we go back to Genesis, we see these same words popping up. For example, later on it says, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, right? And then we also see darkness. So it's a little bit in different positions, but we see these words popping up again about light, about darkness, formlessness. So what John is doing, right, at least in the Greek text of the Hebrew scriptures, he is using the pattern of words, speaking about the beginning, light, formlessness, darkness, comprehending it not. And he's using those pattern of words in his new story about Genesis, the Genesis of man. And we see that same pattern, for example, in the book of Exodus, when the people are being led through the waters across the Red Sea. We see similar patterns of words. Of course, it's different ordering slightly, but the same pattern, you can recognize it when you understand it. Now, this is a genesis of the rebirth of a people. The Hebrew people being led out of Egypt are beginning their new birth, right? Their new beginning. And then it says, for example, you see the words, I don't have the Greek here, but pillar of cloud, cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night, like the dark comprehended it not. And then the sea is driven back, a border is being made, and so you see all these patterns. And these things become kind of codified in the sacred scriptures. That's just a little demonstration. So that's Hebrew. I began with a little bit of Greek, but another sacred language that we have inherited is Greek. When Greek, I don't think I'm pronouncing it right, but this type of Greek was not a high Greek of antiquity, but it was the common Hellenic Greek. Sorry, just one second. Okay. Used by the common people, and it was this type of Greek was spread by Alexander the Great when he went on his kind of spreading the empire eastwards. This Greek became the common language basically from what is modern day Greece, Macedonia, all the way towards Syria and even beyond, Egypt, etc. And this became the common language even in places like Judea, where Jesus preached. And during the time of Jesus, already 300 years had passed since Alexander the Great, but people could mostly, that was like the lingua franca, the common language of the people, the language of communication, especially with outsiders, right? So in Galilee, for example, Greek was spoken for sure. So most of the disciples had some knowledge of Greek. While less people spoke Aramaic at that time, in general in the empire, only in certain regions, right? And Hebrew was basically had become a liturgical language. It wasn't a common spoken language. It was used in a temple, it was used in reading scriptures, etc. So, for example, Jesus most likely, we know he spoke Aramaic, that was the language he spoke, but he probably also did speak some Greek, but he read Hebrew. So we already see an interesting multiplicity of languages that were being used, right, in the time of Jesus. When he read from the scrolls, he was reading Hebrew. Okay. This is an example of what ancient Greek looks like. It's a lot more blocky, a lot more similar to what we recognize as like a legible written language. Now, of course, before I go on, of course, the New Testament itself was written in this Greek. Why? So, yes, the disciples, Jesus most likely preached in Aramaic to the people that he was ministering to, because that was the language they spoke. Maybe it's a little bit of Greek. But when the disciples and apostles went out and preached, when they left Judea, people were speaking Greek. Even as far as Rome, people could understand Greek. Not everyone, but many people. Which is why when they preached and when they decided to write down the gospel and their letters, they wrote in Greek. And these letters of Paul and John and the rest of them remain in Greek. Let's just say that's the original codexes that we have that were copied from the original were Greek. So our New Testament is a Greek document. Now it's interesting because the language that they were using was not some kind of sacred Greek. It was common Greek that was meant to be understood. So let's just keep that in mind as we continue speaking about language. It was a language that was meant to be understood, and it was made sacred by its contents, what the message was being carried by this language. And that message is what elevated this Greek to have a status, let's just say, within the church. You could say that. I mean, Greek scholars might say still states, and it is a simple form of Greek, but it has an elevated authority now because of its contents. Okay. Now, the Bible was also translated into Latin, which became the dominant language of the West. Of course, with the ascendancy of Rome, with Latin being taught and within the Western Church, it was very important to have the scriptures written in Latin. And so there were some early Latin translations before the time of Jerome, Saint Jerome. But Saint Jerome is famous for his translation from the Hebrew and Greek texts of the Bible into what's known as the Vulgate tradition, which basically means the common version. Like we get the word vulgar. Doesn't mean that his Bible was vulgar. It just means that it was common language. So not kind of like some kind of high type of Latin. But it's interesting that even in Jerome's time, which is very early, there were places in North Africa that when they read his translation, there were riots. People did not accept his translation because they had become accustomed to a previous translation into Latin. Because in North Africa, in the Western North Africa, so not Egypt, people were speaking Latin. And so they had translations of these texts into Latin already. But ultimately, it was Jerome's translation that came to be standardized, especially in the time of Charlemagne, which is the period we're speaking about now, the 9th century. And so this Vulgate Latin translation became the common, let's just say, Bible translation that most Western Christians were reading. Okay, and later on, as the Roman Catholic Church spread, they would use this particular translation. It obviously was revised and cleaned up along the way. Okay, so this is how we get to these different languages that we know about in Scripture. Now let's make a quick, quickly speak about the English translations, because it's also important. So most of Western Europe, although there were multiple languages, Germanic languages, and also Latin languages that had its at least a high influence or origin in Latin. So like what became modern day Italian, Spanish, etc. All kind of like variations of Latin with maybe local influence, etc. So Latin became the language of the church. And in general, if you wanted to study, you would learn Latin. If you went to a monastery or you wanted to become a clergyman, you would study Latin. And because of the fall of the Roman Empire, the church was really the place in which a person would study. So Latin became a very unifying actually language in Western Europe, because up until the 18th, even 19th century, because universities and all those places would still teach in Latin. You know, even some of, maybe not most of you, but some of our grandparents were still taught Latin. I mean, my parents still had a little bit of Latin, and we even have vestiges of that in, for example, names of animals and fauna and flora and those things were made in Latin. But of course, in time, certain peoples wanted the scriptures translated into their own language. And in fact, the Catholic Church, or the church before the schism and afterwards the Catholic Church, didn't necessarily ban these things, although it discouraged it often. But you get certain people that began to do this. So, for example, in English, John Wycliffe in the 14th century supported vernacular translations, and he himself, there is such a thing as a Wycliffe translation, and this is what he says: "It helpeth Christian men to study the gospel in that tongue in which they know best Christ's sentence or his words." All right, so Wycliffe came under scrutiny for other things, not necessarily for translating into English. Then later on, following him, William Tyndale, who was a Protestant, so from the Reformed Church, he began translating the New Testament from the German I think it was for his, I can't remember, but basically for the English speakers. And we also can recognize the Tyndale translation, right? So it was definitely, Wycliffe was a Catholic priest, although he was a bit of a rebellious one. Tyndale was a Protestant. And then you have, finally, in the 1600s, on the dot, King James I chose to create an authorized translation of English. And he was unhappy with the Protestant translations because they had a certain, they should say, interpretation in their translations. So, for example, the word king was translated to tyrant when the Protestants translated it, because they were kind of anti-monarchists, and in some cases, at least in the English translation, in Tyndale's translation. And so he didn't want this to be the case, although he was not Catholic. He was Anglican. His mother was Catholic. Was killed. And he was, I think he was, had some Protestant background. But so basically, he gathered together scholars to create, as best as he thought, an unbiased translation of the scriptures. So they had the Greek texts, they had the Latin texts, the Hebrew text for the Old Testament, and there was like 40-something scholars got together and they created a translation. And generally, the translation of the King James Version is seen as a relatively reliable translation because it doesn't have, like some of the earlier translations, a very Protestant flavor where they would specifically interpret things according to their theology, and this was the great trouble. So, and if you look at even some of the direct translations back from the King James English into Greek of the New Testament, it translates pretty directly. Even the ordering of the words is pretty close. So this has become in English the kind of standard version, although not many people I know of Christians actually read the King James Version. They maybe read the New King James Version or another version of the Bible translation. But It's probably the most commonly understood and loved liturgical English, as in used in worship in the Anglican Church, in the Orthodox Church, and some churches with English, because it lends itself, it has a good sound to it. It has a higher a sound as well, because of course it's antiquated English now. And so to us, it sounds very kind of high English. Wasn't necessarily the case when it was translated like that. Okay, so we've spoken a little bit about language, but now let's talk about the saints that we are talking about tonight. Saints Cyril and Methodius, or Cyril and Methodius, right? You can guess the Cyrillic alphabet comes from Cyril, Saint Cyril. Okay, so here we have saints holding the alphabet that they helped to produce to help Slavic peoples. So let's jump right in and start talking about their life journey as missionaries. So their original names was Constantine and Michael. Constantine became Cyril and Michael became Methodius. So they were born in the 9th century in Thessalonica. So the same Thessalonica where that Paul was preaching to the Thessalonians, that Thessalonica, to a senatorial family. And they were highly educated. Their father was the Drungarius of the Byzantine Thema of Thessaloniki, which basically means I'm not actually sure what that title is, but basically he had to take care of the various peoples living within the province, which was the theme basically, including the Slavs of Macedonia. So over many years, hundreds of years, the Slav peoples began to move south. And they began to move in what's Macedonia. And so there was a mixture of language there. There was Greek and there was Slavic. And their mother apparently was a Slav. So their father was Greek and their mother was a Slav. And so they knew Greek and Slavic. They were native speakers of Greek and Slavic, which gave them a huge advantage when later on they would become missionaries to the Slavs, right? And so as they were educated, they were singled out to help in various missions that took place. So I want to tell you about it, but let me first show you a map. Hopefully everyone can see it. It's quite a difficult map to figure out, but I want us to have an idea of what's going on in the world in the 9th century, right? Because we've seen a lot change, right, in these 9th centuries. So now this is where we are. We're looking at kind of this dark pinky purple is the Byzantine Empire, which is now modern day Turkey and Greece. Okay. You see how the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Roman Empire even was holding on to parts of southern Italy. And so that's the Byzantine Christian Empire, right? Then to its west, we have the various kingdoms. After the fall of the Roman Empire, we have these various kingdoms, Kingdom of Italy, the Kingdom of the East Franks, right? Burgundy, etc. And then we have this little space here is the Greater Kingdom of Moravia. This is what is now modern day like Slovakia. Hungary we have below, Kingdom of Bulgaria. And you can see how the Kingdom of Bulgaria is pushing down towards modern day Greece. So the Slavs are basically, all of this section that I'm pointing to here were people who would loosely be identified with the Slavic peoples, okay? We won't get into too much detail of that, but they spoke a Slavic language, different dialects, etc. But the brothers, Cyril and Methodius, they spoke this language, right? Which would be, Thessaloniki is what is here somewhere, okay? So they had contact and they were speaking Slavonic. They were invited, so I want to show you a couple of other empires now. To the east, we have the Abbasid Caliphate, which is the Islamic Empire. Then we have the Armenian Empire, and then here we have the Khaganate of the Khazars, you could say it like that. And they actually became Jewish, interestingly enough. They adopted Judaism as their religion. So we have here an interesting kind of mix. We have Christianity in the West, and in the central part of this map, of course, Eastern Orthodoxy, although the church was also one at this moment, but there was Latin type of Christianity, and there was Greek Christianity, then there was the pagan Slavs, okay, who had begun to adopt Christianity, but slowly. Then we had the Islamic kingdoms in the East, and then we had this interesting Jewish kingdom of the Khazars. It's a very interesting part of history. So that's where we are. Okay, it's just that you have an idea of now what the Byzantine Empire, what are they doing with mission work? What's going on? So here we go. So in 843, then Constantine was invited to Constantinople to continue his studies at the university in Constantinople, basically the place of study. And he was there ordained as a deacon in Constantinople. And he was well versed in theology, and he could speak many many languages of the time: Arabic, Hebrew, Slavonic. And so his first mission was he was sent to the Abbasid Caliphate, and he was sent there to discuss the principle of the Holy Trinity with Arab theologians. So this, of course, was one of the differences between, right, the Christians preached in the Holy Trinity, right? God is one, yet God is three persons, and he has revealed himself as three persons through Holy Scripture, and through his Son Jesus Christ. And so one of his jobs was to try and explain this to the Caliphate in order to bring the Byzantine Empire, you could say, and the Caliphate into better understanding that the Christians are not pagans, associators, as they claimed, and to basically create better ties. So he did this for a while. The success is not really known, but possibly it created some mutual understanding. Then later on, his brother Michael, who later became Methodius, who was first asked to help in the administration of the Slavic portion of the empire, of the theme. And then he went to the monastery, became a monastic on Mount Olympus, which is in Greece. And then he was tonsured as a monastic as Methodius. Then later on, he was sent, so in 860 now, to the Khazars on a missionary expedition to stop them from embracing Judaism. So it was very interesting. So the pagan kingdoms, so what's really interesting is that the remaining pagan kingdoms, which is basically the Slavs, right? So we have Christendom is well established in the Roman Empire. Islam has now become established in the East. But the Slavs and the pagans in the north are still deciding what faith do they want to choose. And so they could now go to all these different faiths, all claiming to be the true thing, and decide for themselves. And it's interesting, the Khazars, they went for Judaism. Now, it's interesting, we'll learn later on that Vladimir of Kiev, he did the same thing. He went and he sent emissaries. We know the story. He sent emissaries to the Latin church, to Hagia Sophia in Constantinople to see how they worship, and to the Muslims, and to the Khazars, and to the Jews. And when his emissaries, as we know, went to see the worship of the Christians in the East, they said, this is the best. We didn't know if we were in heaven on earth. So they chose that. And ultimately it was the Christian Rus, Kievan Rus, that drove out the Khazars, and basically they ceased to exist after over some centuries. But they accepted Judaism, interestingly. And Methodius was not successful at all in converting them, so he was sent back. So that was the beginning of their missionary efforts. But really, the most important moment of their lives, the two brothers, was when they were invited by Prince Rastislav of Moravia to preach Christianity in his kingdom. Now, the reason why Prince Rastislav wanted these brothers, these educated brothers that spoke Slavonic, was because at that time, the only missionaries that were preaching there were German missionaries who were preaching in Latin. and they were enforcing this kind of foreign culture, Germanic culture, and Latin language that was not part of the Moravian people, right? And so Prince Rastislav wanted the people to hear the gospel, and to have Christianity in their own local language, and they wanted it to be, let's just say, centralized in their own land and not dependent on something far away. He didn't want foreign influence influencing his kingdom as well. So he invited them, and it was here where Cyril and Methodius began to develop an alphabet for the Slavic peoples, because they recognized that both the Greek and the Latin letters were not sufficient for the language, the sounds and the expressions, etc. And so they took the basis of the language was from Greek, which is why you can recognize many of the letters, but also some from Hebrew even, and some other runic types of symbols, and they developed an alphabet in which they could codify the language. Okay, so I just want to let someone in. Sorry about that. So Cyril and Methodius began to codify the language, and the first language that it was not actually what we know as Cyrillic, but Glagolithic, which was already an existing written language, but they cleaned it up, they sorted it out, and they began to translate things into Glagolithic. That's an example of Glagolithic. Okay, doesn't look much like modern, well, later Cyrillic. So, and they were very successful. Of course, the people were happy. The Prince Rastislav was happy that the scriptures were being translated into their language. They had a written language in which to now translate all these texts, these sacred texts. And the people chose Cyril and Methodius. When missionaries came to town, if these Latin-speaking missionaries came, the people weren't very excited. But if the Cyril and Methodius came, they accepted what they were preaching, and they were supported. This caused some trouble, and the German clergy that were preaching there began to send accusations to the Pope of Rome, because remember, that was still his jurisdiction. The jurisdiction of Rome extended up to the north, to that the Germanic peoples, and slightly to the east, which is Moravia, which is like Slovakia, those type of places, modern places. And the German clergy accused them that they were not preaching in Latin, the sacred language, right, of the Roman Church, and various other things. And so after serving there for about 4 years, they were called by the Pope of Rome, Nicholas I, to defend what they were doing, their mission, to explain themselves, basically. And they did very well. They went to Rome, and although Nicholas died, before their arrival, Adrian II became the new Pope. And Adrian was very much in favor of what Cyril and Methodius were doing. And he actually approved the texts that they had translated, and he reinstated them as missionaries, and he sent them back. And it was actually there where Constantine took monastic vows in a Greek monastery in Rome, and he took the name Cyril. But he actually died there in Rome before he could return back to Moravia. So they were sent back, and they again began to preach in Slavonic, and Slavonic began its journey as one of the sacred languages, right, of the peoples, because many Slavic peoples were becoming Christian. But again, these other missionaries became jealous, and they again began to persecute Methodius. And so what happened was, as the various kingdoms were fighting against each other, if there was a pro-Latin ruler, then they would get persecuted, right? And it went back and forth. And unfortunately, the new Pope of Rome was Stephen, I think Stephen can't remember which one. He actually again sided against Cyril and Methodius, and basically he where can I go from it? Drove them out, right? So what happened was, after Methodius then died, after having translated many texts, his successor, Gorazd, so these names are very difficult, he was driven out by Pope Stephen V, and they disallowed Slavic from being used in the liturgy, right? And so they were driven away from Moravia, and then they went to the Bulgarian Empire. And the prince, or Prince Boris, the baptizer of Bulgaria, he's a saint in the church. He accepted the students of Cyril Methodius, and they began basically translating many texts in Ohrid. This is the ancient city of Ohrid. And so their disciples began this huge work of translating all the various sacred texts into Slavonic. And it was here where Cyrillic really became used in Preslav. And this became also the foundation upon which Kievan Rus also accepted Christianity, and later then the greater part of Russia, was through this missionary work, by having the Slavonic text available that was primarily translated in Bulgaria. So it's interesting, the Church Slavonic is actually to a kind of Bulgarian dialect of Slavic language, interestingly enough. Now, I jumped a little bit ahead, but basically, let's talk a little bit about Cyril and Methodius and their works in translation. So they began with this alphabet, the Glagolithic. This comes from Croatia. This is the oldest Glagolithic inscriptions that they found. Now, before this, the Slavic people had no written words, right? From a famous man, he's just called the Brave Monk. In some of his writings, he said the Slavs didn't have books before, but being pagan, they read and calculated with lines and strokes. So he's usually talking about runes here, but the Slavs didn't really have a systematized written language. And so the fact that Cyril and Methodius were able to provide that for them was a major shift in the Slavic peoples. It's something that united them. And another amazing thing about this, right, the Slavic peoples, now I'm talking about Bulgaria, modern-day Bulgaria, and then the greater Rus from Kiev and beyond, was that what it did was it provided these peoples with the Holy Scriptures written. And what's interesting is that the Slavic peoples, the first writings they received were Christian writings. So unlike the Greeks, for example, who already had the great philosophers and scientific type of writings, and Herodotus's historical writings, pre-Christian writings. So they had a whole library of literature pre-Christian. While the Slavic peoples, the first writing they received was the Bible. And then it was the writings of the church fathers. And then it was the hymns of the church, etc., etc., etc. So what it did was it created this very unique Christian culture, because their first experience of written language was within a Christian context. Okay, and we see this even when Cyril and Methodius, after having devised the alphabet, what did they translate? The first thing they did was they translated the Holy Scriptures, and they began with the Gospels. And it's interesting, they didn't begin with the Gospel of Matthew, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, They began with John, the first liturgical reading of the year, which is read on Pascha night, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's the first thing they translated. The Gospel of John, the first beginning of John. Because liturgically, that was what would be read at the beginning of the year. And then they translated the canons of the church and other Christian literature. So later on in Slavonic, they would receive maybe some writings from the non-Christian writings, but it really created a very strong Christian culture. Another thing that was interesting is that the people went from being illiterate to having no writing to having quite a high literacy. And these kingdoms, like in Ohrid, in Bulgaria, and in Kiev, we see that writing was like kind of caught like wildfire, and people would write a lot, and there's a lot of fragments, etc., from these periods where people began to write. So what Cyril and Methodius did was really brought a means in which the Slavic peoples could receive the scripture, keep it, and liturgically use it. Okay. Here's some examples of Slavonic, right? Not this section, that's Latin script. Okay. So, although Cyril and Methodius didn't see the fruits of a lot of their labor, of course, in the Russian Orthodox Church, in all the Slavic-speaking churches, Bulgarian Church, Cyril and Methodius are really highly venerated saints. They are seen as the enlighteners of the Slavic peoples, the equal to the apostles, because they brought the language in the local dialects of the people. And Slavonic, Church Slavonic became a sacred language that to this day is cherished by the Slavic churches. And we'll discuss a little bit about this question. But now I want to open a little bit of a discussion about this, because we have, for example, a sacred language like Hebrew, right? Which at least some portions of the Jews didn't want to translate. They preferred to keep Hebrew and make people study Hebrew in order to read the scriptures, while other Jews living in the diaspora especially said, no, we must translate the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, into Greek, is what we speak, which is where we get the Septuagint, right? And then in other religions, for example, in Islam, we have the same thing, where they say Arabic, we received our religious revelation in Arabic, therefore our primary language is Arabic, and the revelation must not be translated into other languages, rather we must learn Arabic, right? Which is why when you go to madrasa or whatever school, they teach Arabic, right? So what is our stance as Christians? What do we do? What is it important what Cyril and Methodius did, or should the Slavs have just learned Greek, right? What is an original language? What is the value of a translation, right? Should we only use ancient languages, or should we use vernacular languages, as in spoken languages? And this is an interesting question. Now, in the early church, sometimes church writers would say that the three languages that were placed on the sign that was placed above Christ on the cross are the three languages in which we should read the Holy Scriptures, right? Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, right? That was a view adopted by some, because they said it was kind of revealed by those languages being on the cross. Maybe it was just because those were the languages spoken by the people at the time that would be looking at that sign. But let's look at what the church has done. Now, the church has what I could say in my estimation is that has had its primary focus has always been to make the revelation of God revealed in Scripture, and also through, let's just say, even before the writing of the New Testament, the revelation of Christ and his teachings, to be understandable to the people. So that was the primary focus. That is why the New Testament was written in Koine Greek and not some Homeric Greek, right? They weren't trying to create a high culture or something like this. They were trying to relay the message as clearly and as possible to the people. Now, what happened is that when the Christians would come into contact with people who did not have a written language, the church or the saints from within the church took it upon themselves to give those people their own language, a written language, right? So that they may receive the scriptures. So it's really interesting that they gave them a set of symbols based on possibly what they already, something that they had, in order that the scriptures may be kind of breathed into them. It's an amazing kind of image. And this is what we see happen very early on, even before Cyril and Methodius, with Saint Mesrop Mashtots. It's a very nice name, Armenian saint, who translated who created the Armenian alphabet, which also became the basis for the Georgian alphabet and some other alphabets in the beginning of the 5th century. And this allowed the Armenian people, Armenian-speaking people, to have the scriptures in their own language. And this was done by saints of the church. Then we see Saints Cyril and Methodius do the same thing for the Slavic peoples. And we see this continue even up to someone as late as Saint Innocent of Alaska, who in the 1800s, when he learned about the Aleuts in what is now Alaska, he went there and he learned the language. He took the Cyrillic alphabet, but then he adapted it to the sounds and some of the eccentricities of Aleut, and he created their own kind of Neo-Cyrillic alphabet for the Aleuts, so that they could receive the Gospels, etc. And he apparently translated the Gospel of St. Matthew for them. And then later on, more translations took place. So what I was trying to say, what I can at least take from this, is that the church in general strives so that all peoples will receive the gospel and the scriptures within their own language, because their language is intrinsically valuable and good. And this speaks into the goodness of every culture and people, because a lot of people say, they see Christianity as this kind of like colonizing force or something that drives out all the good parts of localization, local culture, local customs, etc. But that's not really the case. Like, if you look carefully at history, you'll see that the church, at least, and the holy people of the church, come and they try to elevate the culture and the civilization so that it may receive the gospel, right, with the written language. And this is where we would say the Latin church, as it drifted away from orthodoxy, one of its mistakes was its rigid use of Latin. Now, of course, there were vernacular translations, and we already see before the Protestant Reformation that certain hierarchs would allow, for example, Sunday services could be served in Latin and the local language. Like the gospel would be read in German and Latin or whatever. But generally, Latin became this language that was preferred above others. And we see that already happening in the mission in Moravia in the time of Cyril and Methodius. And ultimately, because of that rigidity, they lost out. And the Slavic peoples in general looked towards the Eastern Church, because the Eastern Church accommodated their language and respected their language enough to codify it into a sacred liturgical language that it still remains to this day, right? And so what happened was, only later on, the Roman Catholic Church, what it did was, it's Vatican II, but even before that, it began to promote the use of vernacular. And it actually flipped, where the use of Latin was actually kind of pushed out totally, and it was seen as archaic. And now it's kind of flipped on its head, where the Roman Catholic Church has all the different translations, uses local languages, and now traditional Catholics want to go back to Latin because they feel like there's something lost. So it's kind of a complicated thing. While in Orthodoxy, there's never really been a discussion whether or not a local people should have a language, their local language, as part of a liturgical setup. But there's another problem that we have in Orthodoxy, and is that the church is very old. The church is around for 2,000 years. And language develops, right? But when something has been codified into the liturgical life, it doesn't change, including Church Slavonic, including in the English world, King James English, right? And so what's often happened is, and we see this, for example, in Ethiopia, you've got Ge'ez, which is the ancient language, and then you've got Amharic, which is the more spoken language. Now they serve their services, their liturgical life in Ge'ez. In Russia, people speak modern Russian, but they serve in Church Slavonic. Now that brings another question which I want us to discuss, is when should it what is the value of having an established liturgical language and keeping it? How long should you keep that? Or when should be the point where it should be revised, or should it be revised? Because there's lots of things that can happen. So, for example, we want the sacred scriptures and the hymns of the church, the language of the church that we hear in church, to be a fitting vessel of what the message is, right? So we want the language to have a richness and a complexity that can best convey the message. And what generally happens with local dialects and vernacular is that the language gets simplified. And then what happens is, if the people don't remain educated, they no longer understand some of the words. So if I say to you, suffereth the little children to come unto me, what does that mean? Can anyone tell me? Suffereth the little children to come unto me.
Does it mean simply let the little children come unto me?
Let, yeah, like allow, or let the little children. Now, of course, that has a different meaning, right? In our usage, right? And another example is, for example, in Slavonic, the word život. Život in Church Slavonic means life. But in modern Russian, it means stomach, like tummy, right? Now there is actually, you could go deep into that and say, well, yes, the deepness of my being, is my life. But it sounds, like život in modern Russian is not a very fancy word. It's like tummy, basically. So again, should it be changed? And there was a whole discussion about these words, these archaic words that have the meaning has changed. And so that's a discussion that still goes on. And the English speaking world has it particularly bad because we have so many translations of the scriptures now. But generally, and the Orthodox Church in its various English-speaking churches, so you have the Greek Orthodox Church in America, you have the Russian Church abroad, and they all have chosen different translations of English to use. So we can discuss that. But let's look at a couple of things. So with translation, every translation is an interpretation, 100%. And so the translators, or the person who's motivated behind the translations, need to be aware of what the goal is, right? That's why it's great when you have saints, translating your scriptures. Saint Cyril, Methodius, they were learned men, but they were also holy men. We didn't really get into a lot of the amazing miracles they performed and things like that. But that's a wonderful thing. But if you've got a random, the new revised living ministries, whatever translation, you need to know, like, what is the motivation behind that? It could even be monetary, because maybe that group or that church just wants to publish their own Bible, and sell a couple of 100,000 copies, whatever it may be. Or they want to push their theology. So, and it's very difficult, even for the early translators, even for the Septuagint translators, it was a difficult thing. So I'll give you an example. In 1 Samuel, we hear David saying this, okay? So this is the literal translation from Hebrew. No. Sorry, this is the interpreted translation from Hebrew. So David is saying that if she had not done this, truly by morning there would not have been left to Nabal so much as one male. Not one male would be left. But this is the direct translation from Hebrew. Truly by morning there would not have been left to Nabal so much as one who pisses against a wall. Now what does that mean? Who pees against the wall? A male. But men pee against the wall because they're standing and peeing, right? So that was an expression, like a Hebrew expression for a male, right? So now most translations don't translate like that. You know, truly by the morning would not have been left to Nabal so much as one who pees against the wall. No one does that translation. One who is a male, right? Or a man. So there is that choice. Like, are we going to use this direct translation, but then it's going to be lost, or people are going to be like, what? What does that mean? Like, is that an insult now? You know what I mean? So it's a very difficult thing. And so translations have to try understand the figures of speech to convey the meaning of it, which is primary, but not go too far from the text. So I put in, just to show how far away we can get from this Holy Scriptures with these very, very loose dynamic translations. This is an excerpt from the Holy Bible hip-hop version, and that's a real thing. Like, it's not even a joke. This is Psalm 23, at least part of Psalm 23. Forgive me, Lord, for reading this, but I just want to show you guys how far away, how dynamic one can translate and interpret things. The Lord is all that I need for nothing. He allows me to chill. He keeps me from being heated and allows me to breathe easy. He guides my life so that I can represent and give shout-outs in his name. And even though I walk through the hood of death, I don't back down, for you have my back. So that's the hip-hop version of Psalm 23. Now, maybe this is a introduction for some people to the scriptures, but it definitely should not be a replacement of a better translation, right? So the question is that, should we as Christians strive to be educated so that we can understand the scriptures in a closer language, or should we allow for a dynamic translation? So maybe I'll ask you guys that question. Okay, I want to say one more thing before I can ask some questions. But one thing that's interesting is that the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church as well, by extension, have a different consideration to keep as well. Because you must remember that an average Protestant preacher is not that interested in the sound of the language, the uniformity of the language, because he's using it in like a preaching kind of a preaching way. So for example, like if a preacher is going into the hood, maybe he will take the hip-hop Bible or something, because it's going to maybe do him a lot better than if he starts preaching in King James English in the ghetto, right? Also, let's just say televangelists, for example, they're not praying, they're not necessarily singing hymns from the text. They're preaching their certain sermon, and so for them, maybe a very dynamic, easy to understand translation is what they want, because they want everyone to understand what they're reading. They don't want to explain now what the text means. So they have a different one-sided use of scripture. But now, in the Orthodox Church, we have the liturgical use of language. And this is very important because liturgy is a common work of the people. That's what it means, right? Common prayer. We hear the scriptures together, we read them together, and so we need to have a common language. So the wonderful thing, for example, about Slavonic, Church Slavonic, is that you can say Our Father in Serbia, in Russia, in Belarus, and Ukraine, and everyone knows what you're saying. And everyone recognizes that as the sacred version of Otche Nash, right? And that's because it's the liturgical way in which it's read, right? And it sounds right to the ear, not because it's somehow more sacred, I wouldn't even say that, but because it's been used in a sacred context so much that it has become kind of that to the ear of a Slavic person sounds like church language, just like King James Version sounds like to us. So, for example, the one time I had the Russian synodal translation of the gospel, and I read that in church by accident in Russia, and everyone was like, "That sounded so weird. Like, what Russian was that? Was that Slavonic?" And I was like, "No." So I didn't know, and then they explained to me, "No, that's an old Russian translation, and it sounds so strange. It sounds disrespectful," even they said. So the thing is, that's something we have to take into consideration. Because we want, when we go to church and we hear the Holy Scriptures, we want our ears to recognize that this is sacred Scripture. This is sacred language that we all understand and we recognize. And so we have to then say, well, if we don't understand what it means, suffereth the little children, then maybe we should learn what suffereth means instead of lowering our language and then we lose the liturgical value of it, right? We have, I just wanted to show you, we have so many sayings in English that we don't even know are from the King James Version, labor of love, a thorn in the flesh, all things must pass, many are called, few are chosen, my cup runneth over, out of the mouths of babes. All these things we say are from the King James Bible, King James Version. And those expressions and idioms are all from the scriptures, have been kind of, they've lasted 400 years. They're in our expressions because it was the common liturgical language for the English-speaking world for so long. So that shows something that's very important. So I'll give you my little conclusion, then I'm going to ask questions. I'll stop presenting now. So from what I can understand is that the church has two different roles to play. The one is the church has a missionary purpose to bring the gospel and the scriptures to the people in the language that they understand. And this requires translation, interpretation, and letting go sometimes of the original language for the sake of the people. So that language can become holy and sacred if it is used correctly, reverently, liturgically. It gets assumed by the people, and then that language becomes a liturgical language, right? So Slavonic in the beginning was not a sacred language, but now Church Slavonic to Russians, etc., is a sacred sounding language. So it is made sacred. That's the one side of the church, and that allows for the more liberal translation into different languages. But the church also has to make sure that it keeps a high level of articulation, a high level of sounding language, so that we will be reminded that this is sacred scripture and that it's not just like, whatever, any kind of speech. So I think there is a balance that has to take place, which is why, for example, the Russian Orthodox Church hasn't moved to modern Russian, which is why in some Orthodox churches in the English-speaking world, they have decided to read the Gospels, for example, on Sunday in King James Version or New King James Version and not in some newer translation because they recognize it as the liturgical language. So Yeah, I think it's been, sorry, I went way over time. But are there any questions or comments about translations, especially, and what people think about that? And what language should be used in church? Like, how do we decide what language we should use in church? It's a difficult thing for me as well, as a priest, because we have different people wanting different things.
How many books does the Orthodox Bible have?
How many is it? 27 books of the New Testament. Someone help me with the Old Testament. It's 60. I can't remember, 67. But basically, we have a larger canon than.
66 books.
Sorry?
The Protestants have 66 books
66, yeah.
in the Old
Um,
Testament.
I may have added Enoch there by accident. But yeah, 66. So, so the Orthodox Bible has a larger canon because it doesn't. The Jewish scholars removed some books that from the Masoretic texts that became known as Apocrypha or Deuterocanon, but were always accepted in the Septuagint translation. Yeah.
Father, I don't know if you said, but what translation do we use?
So in church, when I read the gospel, we use the recommendations from the Russian church abroad, which uses the King James version. Maybe slightly revised, but we still say use thee, thou in the reading of the gospel. In some of the liturgical texts, because we have a mixed bunch of texts, it varies from thee, thou, you, your, depending on where we get the translation. So it's a bit of a mix, but the gospel is read in King James.
Do we use a different translation for the epistle?
I think the epistle isn't, but I must just check. No, I think it's also King James version, maybe New King James version, but it should be the King James.
Father, I think they use King James for both. I think those recommendations that we had, they used to use something else in parts, but not
they
that
went back
long
to
ago.
King
I think
James.
they've changed over to everything being King James.
King James, yeah. Seems like that's the case. But that's now the Russian church abroad, and they serve in many English-speaking countries. But the Greek Orthodox Church uses a much different translation. I don't even know what it is, but it's very, very, let's just say, like common English. Because their churches, they primarily serve in Greek, and then they read the gospel in Greek, and then they read in English so that people understand. So they're not interested in preserving any kind of ancient or like better English. They're just interested in making sure people understand. So it varies as well.
And do the Greeks still use the Koine Greek?
Yes, liturgically and when they read the gospel. I mean, I think there have been some changes, like the Byzantine received text had some changes, but basically, yes, yeah.
So,
Okay, thank
Father,
you.
they call it like kata. Is it word with a K? That particular Greek they use in the church.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's called, I think, isn't it Katharevusa?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sort of purified.
Yeah.
Oh, is that what it
Kata,
means? Okay.
kata means like down, no?
I think it's from the adjective katharos, which means like pure, like Saint Catherine, that root.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, an average Greek, if they study a little bit of the New Testament Greek, they could read the Gospels and understand them. Although there are different verbs and things sometimes. So, yeah.
And I know in Greek schools they study ancient Greek.
Yeah, but that also can be different. I mean, Chrysostomos can tell us more about that because he teaches it, but that also has to do with, that can be different types of Greek, like Homeric Greek, Attic. I don't know all the different Greeks, but to read older texts. Not and the New Testament Greek is not like highly looked upon in academic circles, from what I know. Hey, Chrysostomos.
So far, I'm no expert in that, as you know, but I don't think it's looked down upon at all. I mean, it's my feeling is that people tend to downplay the register. You know that that as if it's as if it would be just the Greek spoken by people working in a harbor, but I don't think it is like that. If you look at the papyri from Egypt, where people are really writing to one another about sending their kids some sandwiches for school and that kind of thing, I think the New Testament Greek is more elevated. That's my view, but anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I don't expect the apostles were like trying to preach in like the hip hop Bible version of Greek or something. I think I agree with you. It wasn't just this like common Greek, but it was a understandable version.
Yes.
They weren't trying to be somehow antiquated or something. I mean, you even get, like we spoke about, the speech of Saint, who was it? Saint Gregory Nazianzus. He would write sometimes in a more ancient Greek, like for his wedding gift as a poem.
Yes.
I don't think the apostles were doing things like that. Yeah. So yes, yes, Nina.
Hello, Father Nicholas. If I have a Bible which has less books than the Orthodox Bible, like the New King James Version that I have, should I keep it and read it, or should I buy a Orthodox Bible?
You can absolutely read it. Look, so the books that are missing are important, but I mean the rest are also good, and so read everything that's in there, and then when you finish it, then I'll have an Orthodox Study Bible ready for you, or another one with the other books. So look, in general, it's better to read what we have. Most translations in general are fine for average reading. It's when we maybe want to get into some details, there may be some differences, but in general, I think we shouldn't get too caught up on if it's the English Standard Version or if it's the New King James Version, or even the New International Version. Like, of course, there's going to be people will disagree with me, but I personally think that we should read as much as possible from the translation that is good for us. Don't dive into something that's really off the rails, but I would say it's important for us, and I would recommend to read the version that's read in your church. So unfortunately, that's the King James Version, but so that you can liturgically follow on as well as possible, right? So that it becomes common. So, for example, like Our Father, even in English, we always get confused. Are we saying debtors? Are we saying trespassers? And it gets actually disturbing in a way, because we have so many different versions, unfortunately. So we should try to synchronize with our fellow Christians that we worship with. Okay. I think we must go. It has been long. Thank you everyone so much. There's no questions or comments. I didn't realize. Yes.
I just want to say, it was from earlier in the talk, but you had that picture of the ox, and then that became the letter A. But what's quite interesting with some words still in use in Hebrew is you can see the connection to the origin of the letter, because they always started off with a picture that started with the sound they were trying to represent. So with the letter M, I think in modern Hebrew, mime is water. MEIM is how it's transliterated, but I think the letter is called mem in the older form.